The winter of 1874 taught Céline Broussard that having enough wood was not the same problem as having dry wood. She had learned this distinction in the way that most useful distinctions are learned in the Louisiana parish country, by going through a winter without understanding it and arriving in March with a specific and accurate knowledge of what had gone wrong. She entered the winter of 1874 with what she calculated to be adequate firewood. Her son, Theodore, had cut and stacked it against the north wall of the house in October before he returned to his work in Natchitoches, and the stack by her measurement was larger than the stack that had served the family through the previous winters when Émile was alive. She had no reason to expect difficulty. The difficulty began with the first long rain. Natchitoches Parish in December operates on a rain schedule that a person from the northern states would not immediately recognize as winter weather. There is no snow, or almost never, and when there is, it is gone in a day. There is no sustained cold of the kind that locks the ground and kills everything on the surface. What there is, in December and January and February, is rain, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days of continuous grey low-sky rain that soaks into everything without ceasing, the air itself holding more moisture per cubic foot than the wood in the pile beside the house can resist absorbing. The outdoor temperature in Natchitoches Parish in December is rarely below 40 degrees and often above 50, and at these temperatures the moisture in the rain-heavy air moves freely into the wood fibre the way it moves in summer, not frozen out, not slowed by cold, but taken in actively by the wood that sits in the wet. By the third day of the first December rain in 1874, the outer course of the woodpile against the north wall had absorbed enough moisture that the split faces of the oak and cypress pieces felt damp to the touch. By the fifth day, the pieces in the second course, the ones that had been sheltered from direct rainfall by the pieces above and beside them, were also noticeably heavier than they had been in October. Céline could feel the difference when she picked them up. The October weight of dry split oak versus the December weight of oak that had been sitting in 85% humidity for 30 days. The difference was not trivial. The wood was heavier, in the way that wet clothing is heavier than dry clothing. The fiber had taken in real moisture, not a surface coating of rain that would burn off in the first minutes, but moisture distributed through the piece's cross-section. The fire she built with this wood on the 6th day of the December rain told her the full story. The pieces caught slowly, reluctantly, needing coaxing that dry wood never needed. When they did catch and begin burning, they produced a white-grey smoke that filled the fireplace opening before the chimney draft pulled it up, smoke from moisture vaporizing out of the wood faster than the wood itself was burning. The smoke turned the kitchen hazy. Her eyes watered. The heat output was half what the same quantity of dry wood would have produced, because a significant portion of the wood's burning energy was being consumed in evaporating the moisture before the wood itself could reach combustion temperature. She used twice as many pieces for half as much warmth, and the kitchen smelled of the smoke that backed up when the draft was insufficient. She managed the first December rain, and the second, but January brought a 9-day rain that did not stop, and by the end of January the woodpile's outer and middle courses were wet enough that the pieces she pulled from it were genuinely difficult to burn. She was rationing, managing, building the fire earlier and keeping it going longer on each piece to compensate for the reduced heat output. By February she had run through the pile faster than she had calculated, twice as fast as dry wood would have been consumed, which meant she reached the end of the pile in February, instead of April. She walked to Jules Matoyer's place on a Tuesday in February and asked if he had wood to spare. Jules was a Creole of color, a family that had owned land in Natchitoches Parish for 3 generations, and he and Émile had had an easy working relationship based on shared boundary problems and a mutual willingness to acknowledge practical reality. Céline and Jules had spoken regularly since Émile died, more as neighbors with adjacent problems than as anything else. She asked him for wood, and he gave her 2 bundles from his own pile, his pile that was also wet, as she could see from the surface condition of the pieces he brought out, and he said, "Every winter here is like this. The wood gets wet. You use more than you think." She took the 2 bundles, and on the walk home she thought about what he had said. Every winter here is like this. It was true. Émile had always complained about wet wood in February, had always cut more than seemed necessary in October to compensate for the efficiency loss in December and January. Every family in the parish with a wood-burning fireplace was managing the same arithmetic. Take the wood you need, double it for wet weather consumption, cut the doubled amount in October. It was wasteful, and it was accepted as the condition of Louisiana winter. She did not accept it, walking home from Jules Metoyer's with the 2 wet bundles. She was not constitutionally inclined to accept inefficiencies that could be thought through. She thought about the problem through February and March, and into the summer of 1875. The house that Emile had built in 1853 was a Louisiana frame house of the style that had been standard in the Natchitoches area since the French colonial period. Cypress timber frame, cypress board walls, cypress floorboards, set on brick pilates, pillars of fired brick in pairs, 1 pair at each corner and 1 pair at the center of each long wall, elevating the house floor 18 inches above the Louisiana soil. The pilates were a practical necessity. The Red River country flooded seasonally, and a house set on the ground would take in water during the spring inundations. Emile had set the pilates on flat limestone slabs that he had hauled from the hill country to the west, so the brick rested on stone rather than directly on the saturated Louisiana ground. The space between the house floor and the ground, 18 inches high, open on all 4 sides between the pilates, was not a storage space by any design. It was a drainage space, a flood-tolerant space, and in summer, a ventilation space. The south breeze that came up the Red River country in July and August ran under the house floor and carried some of the summer heat away from the underside of the floorboards, making the rooms above slightly less unbearable than they would have been on a sealed foundation. The subfloor space was open to everything: rain, wind, animals, the moisture that rose from the Louisiana soil in every season. In June of Wu, Celine began watching the subfloor space systematically. She had not previously paid it much attention. It was the underside of the house, where the structural timbers ran and the brick pilates sat, and nothing happened there that required her attention. But she had a question that the subfloor might help her answer. Was there any location near the house where wood could be stored and remain drier than the outdoor pile? Her first observation was that the subfloor space in summer was not consistently wet or dry. It varied. With the weather in a way the outdoor surface did not. After a day of sun with a south wind, the subfloor soil was dry to the touch, and the structural cypress timbers above it were dry and warm. After a rain, the subfloor soil was wet, and the air in the space was humid, but it dried faster than the outdoor surface. The sun heated the floor above, and the heated floor warmed the air in the subfloor space, and the warm air moved outward through the open sides and carried moisture with it. The subfloor was not sealed. Air could move through it freely, and did. In July, she placed 2 pieces of split cypress in the subfloor space, setting them on a flat stone, so they did not rest directly on the soil. She left them there for 6 weeks. When she retrieved them in late August, she compared them to 2 pieces from the outdoor pile of the same species and approximate dimensions that had been cut at the same time. The outdoor pieces were noticeably heavier. They had absorbed summer humidity continuously through their exposed surfaces. The subfloor pieces were lighter. Not perfectly dry. The summer humidity had affected them too, but measurably drier than the pieces that had sat in the open air for the same period. The subfloor's advantage was the combination of 2 effects. The floor above blocked direct rainfall and direct sun, and the heated floor dried the air below it faster than the open air dried. The disadvantage was also clear. In the summer, the subfloor was warm and somewhat humid, not ideal for drying wood rapidly, but for winter storage, for keeping already cut wood from absorbing winter rain. The subfloor's conditions might be substantially better than the outdoor piles. The problem she had not solved by August was winter rain entry. The subfloor in summer was protected from rainfall by the floor above, but open on all 4 sides to wind-driven rain. In the Louisiana winter, rain came primarily from the south and southwest. The cold fronts that moved up the Gulf Coast brought moisture from the south, and the prevailing wet weather wind direction in December through February was from the south or southwest at 15 to 20 miles an hour. A south wind at 15 miles an hour, driving winter rain would push water into the open south face of the subfloor, wetting the soil and anything stored there. The subfloor in winter rain conditions was not better than the outdoor pile. It was the outdoor pile with a roof. She thought about this through August and September. The solution was obvious once she had framed the problem correctly. If the rain came from the south and southwest, and the subfloor was open on all 4 sides, then closing the south and southwest sides would block the rain entry without eliminating the north and east ventilation that carried moisture away from the subfloor on dry days. She did not need to seal the subfloor completely. Sealing it completely would trap moisture inside the space and make it worse. She needed to block the specific directions from which wet weather arrived, while leaving the specific directions from which dry air arrived. This was not a principle she had read about or been taught. It was a conclusion she had reached by thinking about the problem for 4 months, and watching the subfloor space through a summer. It was also, she was sure, not a principle unique to her. Anyone who thought about it carefully would arrive at the same place. The question was whether anyone in Nakatosh Parish had thought about it before, and if they had, why the standard practice was still to double the wood and accept wet weather losses. In September of 1875, she bought 42 linear feet of 1-inch cypress board from the lumber merchant on the Nakatosh waterfront, the kind of thin board used for interior paneling and light construction. She used it to close the south face and the west face of the subfloor space. Boards nailed horizontally from pilotis to pilotis on the south side, covering the full 18 inches of open space between the floor above and the ground below, and a partial closure on the west side, covering the lower 12 inches of the opening, leaving the upper 6 inches open. The south face was completely closed. The west face was partially closed at the lower level, where rain driven by a southwest wind would enter first. The north face and east face were left entirely open. The oak rails she cut herself in October from a downed live oak on the back of the property, pieces 4 inches square, laid parallel to each other across the closed-in subfloor space at 18-inch intervals, creating a platform that elevated anything resting on them for inches above the Louisiana soil. The rails rested on the flat stones under the pilates, not on the soil itself, so the elevation was effective. The soil moisture that saturated the ground after rain would rise to the soil surface but not reach the rails, and anything on the rails would be 4 inches above the saturation line. She added one detail that she had thought about carefully. One board on the south closure was not nailed, but fitted into a simple channel cut in the adjacent boards, a board that could be removed and replaced without tools. This was the access panel for retrieving wood from the subfloor without going round to the open north or east sides. She could remove the south access board from outside the south face, reach in for the wood she needed, and replace the board. The south face, closed, looked like the rest of the south closure, a continuous surface of horizontal cypress boards from the floor to the ground. The access board was the same width, the same height, the same cypress. Nothing indicated that one board was removable. This was not a deliberate deception, in the way that Abigail Marsh's dado slot access in Rhode Island had been a deliberate deception. It was simply a practical access point that required no hardware and left no visible indication of its function. She loaded the subfloor with the October woodcutting in the second week of October, 1875, to 3 cords of split cypress and live oak that Theodore and his neighbor cut and stacked during a 4-day visit. The wood went in through the north open face, passed along the rails, stacked in rows parallel to the long axis of the house. When the stacking was done, she counted what was in: 2.5 cords on the rails, raised from the soil, closed off from the south and west by the cypress boards. The north face and east face remained open, as she had designed them, to the air that came from those directions on the dry days between rain events. The first test came in November, 4 days of steady rain from the southwest. Celine checked the subfloor on the 4th day of the rain. She removed the south access board, reached in, and pulled out 2 pieces of cypress from the top of the nearest stack. She pressed the cut faces with her fingers, dry. Not the brittle dry of wood that has been in a heated room, but the specific firm dry of wood that has not absorbed moisture, the surface that does not yield when pressed, the weight that is the wood's actual weight, and not the weight of the wood, plus absorbed water. She compared these pieces to 2 pieces she pulled from the outdoor pile, which had been sitting in 4 days of southwest rain in the same period. The outdoor pieces were noticeably heavier, and their cut surfaces yielded slightly under finger pressure, the wood fibers swollen with absorbed moisture. She built the fire that evening with the subfloor pieces, and it caught on the first attempt, burned clean, produced the full heat that dry cypress produces when properly burned. She used 4 pieces for the same warmth that 8 wet pieces had produced in December of 1874. The difference in burn efficiency was the direct and measurable consequence of the moisture content. Dry cypress at 12 to 15% moisture burns at essentially its full caloric value, producing heat proportional to the wood's mass and species. Wet cypress at 25 to 30% moisture The condition of the outdoor pile after 4 days of Louisiana rain expends a significant portion of its burning energy, evaporating the absorbed water before reaching full combustion. The fire is slower, cooler, and smokier for the same quantity of wood. Celine had lived with the wet fire condition for 22 years of Louisiana winters and had accepted it as the way things were. The 4 subfloor pieces burning clean on the first November night told her that the way things had been was not the way they needed to be. The winter of 1875 to 76 ran as Louisiana winters run, the long rain events spaced with shorter dry periods, the temperature rarely below 40, the humidity never fully dropping even on the clear days between rain. The outdoor piles sat in all of it and absorbed all of it, as outdoor piles in Natchitoches Parish had always done. The subfloor pile sat in the same winter and was protected from the south and west rain entry by the cypress boards and elevated above the soil moisture by the oak rails, and the north and east faces remained open on the dry days and allowed the air circulation that carried moisture away from the wood surfaces. By January, the subfloor wood was at 12 to 14% moisture by her informal assessment. The weight, the feel of the surface, the burn behavior, the absence of white smoke and slow catching that characterized wetwood fires. The outdoor pile was at 25 to 30% by the same assessment. She used the subfloor wood exclusively for cooking and heating and left the outdoor pile as the visible reserve that she drew from when she carried an armload in 4 neighbors, or when her own calculations indicated she had sufficient margin in the subfloor. She did not run out of wood in February. She had wood remaining in March when the wet season ended. Jules Matoya came in January, as he had said he would. He had remembered the February of the previous year and wanted to know whether she had managed the winter better. He found her at the kitchen fire with a clean hot burn going and asked what she was using. She took him around the south side of the house and removed the access board and showed him the subfloor. He stood and looked at the wood on the rails in the closed-off space and at the cypress boards that blocked the south and west faces and at the open north and east sides. He said, "You closed the south." She said, "The rain here comes from the south." He said, "Yes." She said, "I left the north open for air." He said, "I see that." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the rails and the wood on them and the closed south boards. He said, "I never thought of it this way." She said, "Neither had I until the last winter." He asked her how she had come to close the south specifically and not the others. She told him what she had observed in the summer: the dry air from the north and east on fair weather days, the rain that came from the south and southwest on the storm days. She told him about the 2 cypress pieces she had left in the subfloor in July and compared to the outdoor pile in August. He listened to all of it. He said, "You measured it." She said, "I put pieces in 2 places and compared them when I came back." He said, "That is measurement." She said, "I suppose it is." He built his own enclosure in September of 1876. He used the same principle: south and west faces closed, north and east open, rails elevated 4 inches from the soil, but adapted it to his house construction, which was a slightly different Pilati configuration than hers. His access panel was on the east face rather than the south, because his east Pilati spacing gave a better access geometry. He told her in November of 1876 that the wood in his subfloor was dry. She said, "The rain still comes from the south." He said, "Yes, and it does not get in." 2 families on the road between her property and Natchitoches town built similar enclosures in 1877 and 1878. Having heard about it from Jules at the Saturday market, the principle traveled accurately: close the wet weather faces, leave the drier faces open, raise the wood off the soil. What it required was not material or skill beyond what any Louisiana householder possessed: cypress boards, oak scraps for rails, a few hours of work in September. What it required was the specific observation that Celine had made in the summer of 1875, that the rain came from a direction, and that closing that direction while leaving the others open would protect the wood without sealing the moisture in. No one in Natchitoches Parish had made this observation before, as far as she could determine, because no one had thought to make it. The wetwood winter fire was accepted, like the summer heat and the seasonal flood, as a condition of living in the Red River country. It was not a problem to be solved, because it had never been approached as a problem to be solved. Celine had approached it as a problem to be solved, because the winter of 1874 had been specific enough in its losses: the doubled wood consumption, the February shortage, the walk to Jules Matoya's, to make her unwilling to repeat it. The solution had required 4 months of observation and the conclusion of one specific piece of reasoning. The rain is directional. The wind is directional, and a structure that accommodates both directions separately is different from a structure that either seals everything or opens everything. The subfloor of her Louisiana house, designed to be open on all 4 sides for flood drainage and summer ventilation, could be made into a functional firewood shelter by selectively closing the 2 faces that mattered for winter rain. The 2 faces that did not need to be closed could remain open to the air that the wood needed to stay dry on the days between storms. She told Theodore about the system in the spring of 1876 when he came for the planting visit. He walked around the house and looked at the south and west closures and the open north and east faces and the access board in the south closure and said, "Mamang, c'est ingénieux," she said. "It is just boards." He said, "It is not just boards," she said. "It is boards in the right places." He said, "Yes, that is what ingénieux means." The specific physics of why the south and west closure worked to keep the subfloor wood dry through a Louisiana winter, and why leaving the north and east faces open was equally essential to the system's function, follows from the behavior of moisture in wood, and the directional characteristics of Louisiana winter weather that Celine had observed without naming as physics. Wood is a hygroscopic material. It absorbs and releases moisture from the surrounding air continuously, seeking an equilibrium moisture content that matches the relative humidity of the ambient air. When the ambient humidity rises, as it does during rain events, the wood surface absorbs moisture, and this moisture migrates inward through the wood's cellular structure. When the ambient humidity drops, as it does on dry days with moving air, the wood releases moisture outward through the surface, and this moisture is carried away by the moving air. The cycle of absorption and release means that wood stored outdoors reaches a moisture equilibrium with the local outdoor climate over time. In the Louisiana winter, with ambient relative humidity averaging 80 to 85% and rain events occurring every few days, outdoor wood equilibrates at 25 to 35% moisture content by February. Wood that burns efficiently, that produces the full caloric output that its species and density make possible, is wood at 12 to 15% moisture content. At this moisture content, essentially all of the burning energy goes into combustion and heat production. As moisture content rises from 15 to 25%, an increasing fraction of the burning energy goes into evaporating the absorbed water before the wood can reach combustion temperature. At 25% moisture, perhaps 15 to 20% of the burning energy is lost to evaporation. At 30 to 35% moisture, which is what Louisiana outdoor pile wood reaches by January, the efficiency loss is substantial enough that wood must be used at twice the rate to achieve the same heat output, which was the empirical result Celine had observed in the winter of 1874. The subfloor system she designed maintained a substantially different humidity environment than the outdoor pile because it addressed the 2 primary moisture delivery mechanisms separately. The first mechanism was direct rainfall, rain falling vertically onto the wood pile. This was blocked by the house floor above, which was true of the entire subfloor space, regardless of whether the sides were open or closed. The floor above was the primary barrier to direct rainfall, and it was effective. No rain fell directly into the subfloor. This was the advantage that the subfloor had over the outdoor pile, even before Celine's modifications. The second mechanism was wind-driven rain, rain that travels horizontally, or at an oblique angle, carried by the wind that accompanies storm events. In Natchitoches Parish, the winter storms that brought persistent multi-day rain came predominantly from the south and southwest as the Gulf Coast weather systems moved inland. Wind at 15 to 20 miles an hour driving rain from the south into the open south face of the subfloor would deposit rain on the soil, and on anything stored in the space within a foot of the south face. Over a 3 or 5 day rain event, this lateral rain entry would saturate the soil near the south face and raise the humidity in the enclosed space enough to drive moisture absorption in the wood stored there. Celine's south and west closure boards blocked this lateral rain entry. Rain from the south hit the closed south face and ran down the face of the boards to the soil outside the subfloor space rather than entering it. Rain from the southwest, arriving at an angle, hit the closed west face and the closed south face and was deflected similarly. The rain delivery mechanism was severed for the 2 directions from which rain was delivered. The third mechanism was ambient humidity, the moisture held in the air itself. which wood absorbs through its surfaces regardless of whether rain is directly contacting it. On a day with 85% relative humidity and still air, wood will absorb moisture from the surrounding air, even without rain contact. This mechanism could not be blocked by the south and west closures. The air inside the closed-off subfloor space would still equilibrate to ambient outdoor humidity on still humid days, but it could be countered by the fourth mechanism, air movement. On the days between rain events, the clear dry days when the ambient humidity dropped, and a north or east wind moved through the parish, the north and east open faces of the subfloor allowed this drier moving air to pass through the space. Moving air carries moisture away from wood surfaces more effectively than still air. The air layer immediately adjacent to the wood surface becomes saturated with the wood's outgassed moisture, and if that air layer is replaced by fresh dry air, the outgassing continues. Still air becomes saturated near the wood surface, and moisture transfer slows or stops. Moving air sustains moisture transfer as long as the incoming air is drier than the wood surface moisture level. Celine's open north and east faces allowed the fair weather north and east winds to move through the subfloor space, carrying away moisture from the wood surfaces on the dry days. This was the mechanism that actually dried the wood, rather than merely protecting it. The south and west closures protected the wood from rain entry on wet days, and the north and east openings allowed air movement to dry the wood on fair days. The combination meant the wood was protected during the moisture input events and dried during the moisture removal events. The rails that elevated the wood 4 inches above the soil addressed the fifth mechanism, capillary moisture from the saturated Louisiana ground. In the Red River country in winter, the soil within the top 8 to 12 inches is at or near saturation for most of the season. The frequent rain events refill any moisture that has drained or evaporated in the intervals. Wood resting directly on this soil absorbs moisture through direct contact with the wet soil surface. The capillary action of the wood's cellular structure draws moisture upward from the contact point, and a piece of wood resting on saturated soil can absorb several percentage points of moisture through its base in a week. Celine's oak rails, resting on the flat limestone slabs that Emile had placed under the pilates, elevated the wood 4 inches above the soil surface, enough that soil capillary moisture could not bridge the gap to the bottom of the wood pieces. The combination of these 5 addressed mechanisms produced the 12 to 14% moisture content that Celine assessed in January 1876. The outdoor pile, subject to all 5 mechanisms without mitigation, produced 25 to 30%. The difference, roughly 15 percentage points of moisture content, translated directly into the burn efficiency difference she had experienced. One subfloor piece producing approximately the same heat as 2 outdoor pile pieces. The Necottish parish, Creole community in which Celine Broussard and Jules Matoya both lived and operated in the 1870s, was a community with a specific historical character that shaped the transmission of practical knowledge in ways different from the Anglo-American communities in the other accounts in this series. Natchitoches was the oldest permanent European settlement in the Louisiana Purchase territory, founded by the French in 1714 on the Red River. By 1875, the community had developed over a century and a half into a mixed society that included French-speaking Creole whites of generations old Louisiana descent, Creoles of color, whose families had also been in the region for multiple generations, and who had, before the Civil War, included among them some of the largest slave-owning landholders of African and European mixed descent in the South. Freed black families and their communities, more recent Anglo-American settlers from the eastern states, and smaller numbers of German and Irish immigrants. The Creole community, both white and of color, shared a French-language culture that was distinct from the Anglo-American culture that had become dominant in Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This cultural distinctness included a set of practical traditions around house construction, agricultural practice, and community exchange that had developed over a century and a half of life in the specific conditions of the Red River country. The Pilote house construction was part of this tradition. Every Creole house in the region was built on brick piers for the same flood tolerance reason, and the subfloor space was a known feature of every house's construction. What was not part of the tradition was the specific use of the subfloor space for firewood storage, with selective closure for rain protection. The subfloor had always been understood as a drainage and ventilation space, not a storage space. To store anything in it was to accept that it would be subject to the same moisture conditions as the outdoor environment. Because the subfloor was open on all sides by design, the leap that Celine made, understanding that the subfloor could be selectively closed on some faces while remaining open on others, producing a space that was protected from directional rain while remaining open to directional dry air, was not part of the established tradition of using the space. Jules Métoyer's response to seeing the system, "I never thought of it this way," was accurate. The system required thinking about the subfloor differently from how it was habitually thought about, not as an open space where anything stored would be exposed to weather, but as a space whose exposure to weather could be modified in specific directions without modifying it in all directions. This was a small reconceptualization of a familiar space, but it was a reconceptualization that no one in the community had made before Celine made it. The spread of the knowledge through the community after Celine showed Jules in January 1876 followed the pattern of practical knowledge transfer in Creole communities, person to person through direct demonstration and description, without written documentation or formal instruction. Jules told his neighbors at the Saturday market. His neighbors built their own versions, adapting the principle to their specific house configurations. The adaptation was not exact replication. Each house's palati placement, compass orientation, and available materials produced a specific version of the closure system, but the underlying principle was transmitted accurately. Identify the direction from which wet weather comes. Close the faces in those directions. Leave the faces in the other directions open. By 1880, there were, by Celine's informal accounting, 11 households in the Natchitoches area who had built some version of the subfloor firewood enclosure. Not all of them had gotten it right on the first try. 2 families she knew of had closed all 4 faces initially, following the intuition that more closure meant more protection, and had found that the fully enclosed subfloor actually retained moisture because the drying air circulation was blocked. They had opened the downwind faces on their second attempt, and the system had worked. The failure mode, overclosure, suppressing ventilation, was itself instructive, because it demonstrated why partial closure was the correct design and not a compromise, but the intended solution. Celine explained this distinction to anyone who asked. You need to know which direction the rain comes from and which direction the dry air comes from. They are not the same direction. Close the rain direction. Leave the drier direction open. The design is about the difference between the 2 directions, not about closing or opening as a general principle. The cypress wood that Celine used for the south and west closure boards, the same cypress that Emile had used to build the house in 1853 and that she used for all repairs and modifications, was the standard construction material of Natchitoches Parish because of a property that made it specifically suited to the Louisiana climate. Naturally occurring oils in cypress. Heartwood resist moisture penetration and biological decay to a degree that makes untreated cypress far more durable than pine, oak, or other commonly available species when used in exterior or semi-exterior applications. Louisiana, bald cypress, the species native to the Red River country and the swamps of the lower parishes, contains thujoplicins, a family of naturally occurring compounds that inhibit the growth of fungi, bacteria, and wood-boring insects. These compounds, concentrated in the heartwood of mature cypress trees, give the wood its characteristic resistance to rot. Cypress lumber properly extracted from old-growth heartwood and used in exterior construction can last decades, without treatment or painting in conditions that would cause pine or oak to fail in years. The Creole buildings of Natchitoches that were still standing in the 1870s, after a century of Louisiana weather, were standing because they had been built of cypress, and the cypress had resisted the continuous assault of humidity, rain, and biological agents that degraded other species. For Celine's south and west closure boards, cypress was not merely available, it was the correct material. Pine boards used in the same application in the same climate would have begun to show surface decay within 3 to 5 years of continuous exposure to high humidity and intermittent rain contact. Cypress boards, properly installed with the end grain sealed and the faces exposed to air movement, would maintain their dimensional stability and surface integrity for much longer. The closure boards she installed in 1875 were still sound when she described them to a neighbor in 1884. The oak rails that elevated the wood from the soil had a different justification. Oak was available as downed timber on the property, required no purchase, and was adequate for the compressive load of stacked firewood, resting on 4-inch square sections at 18-inch intervals. The rails were not expected to be permanent. She expected to replace them as they showed wear or decay, but in practice the oak rails lasted through 5 winters before she replaced them with cypress equivalents that she cut from a cypress plank in 1880. The cypress rails had the same dimensional stability and moisture resistance as the wallboards, and she noted that wood stacked on cypress rails showed no evidence of moisture transmission through the contact surface at any point. During the 5 years she tracked it, before leaving the property in 1888. She left the property to Arthur in 1888, when her health made the 15-acre farm too much for her alone. She went to live with her daughter in Alexandria. Before she left, she walked through the subfloor with Thudor and showed him the south and west boards, and the north and east openings, and the oak rails, and the access board on the south face. She told him everything she had learned about why each element was there and what it did. He said, "I remember the winter when you first showed this to me." She said, 1876. He said, "You had the clean fire." She said, "I had the dry wood." The clean fire was the result of the dry wood. He said, yes, he understood the specific season of Céline Broussard's working life that produced the subfloor firewood enclosure, the summer of 1875. Between the problem winter of 1874 and the solution winter of 1875 to 76, is worth examining as a process rather than as an event, because most accounts of practical innovation in the frontier period present the solution without the working through that preceded it. Céline was not a woman with any particular training in what later generations would call engineering or applied science. She had no access to published literature on moisture management in wood storage, no contact with forestry practice as it was developing in the 1870s, no formal instruction in the physics of hygroscopic materials. What she had was the specific motivation of a woman who had run out of fuel in February and been forced to ask a neighbor for help, and the temperament of a person who preferred to understand problems rather than accept them. Her process from February 1874 to September 1875 was approximately as follows. She identified the problem. Wet wood burns badly and is consumed at twice the rate of dry wood. She rejected the accepted solution, cut twice as much, and accept the inefficiency. She asked what conditions would produce dry wood in a Louisiana winter, some kind of shelter from rain, some mechanism to remove humidity. She identified the nearest available dry in winter space, the subfloor, in its theoretical form. She tested the subfloor in summer against the outdoor pile, the July experiment with the cypress pieces. She identified the subfloor's winter failure mode, wind-driven rain from south and southwest. She designed a closure that addressed the failure mode without eliminating the ventilation benefit, south and west closed, north and east open, and she built and tested the design in the winter of 1875 to 76. Each step in this sequence was available to any Natchitoches Parish householder in the 1870s. The observations she made were not requiring special access or expertise. The materials were available to every household. The construction was within the skills of anyone who could drive a nail. What was not available to every householder was the specific motivation that made Céline work through the sequence rather than accept the problem. Jules Metoyer, when he said he had never thought of it this way, was describing the absence of that motivation. He had accepted wetwood winters as the condition of Louisiana winter, and the acceptance had prevented the thinking that would have produced the solution. "Every winter is like this," he had said. It was not a complaint or a resignation. It was an accurate description of the accepted state of affairs. Céline had heard it as a description of something that needed to change. This is the specific nature of the solution in this account. Not a tradition brought from another culture, not a discovery made in extremis, not a principle learned from a parent or elder, but a systematic working through of a problem that everyone else had accepted as a fixed condition of Louisiana life. The subfloor boards and the oak rails were the material result of 4 months of careful looking at a space that had been under her feet for 22 years and thinking about what it could do differently. The solution was always there in the structure of the house. The question was whether anyone had thought about it. She had. In the summer of 1875, she had thought about it until she understood it. In September, she built what she had understood. In December, the fire burned clean. The firewood that Céline stored in the subfloor enclosure in October 1875 The cut cypress and live oak that her son Theodore and his neighbor spent 4 days cutting and splitting was already at a better moisture content than winter-cut wood would have been, because it had been cut in October and had dried through October in the open air before going into the subfloor. The Louisiana climate's specificity for firewood drying is different from northern climates in one important respect. In Louisiana, October is dry enough for surface drying of freshly cut wood, but not cold enough to dramatically slow the moisture removal process. October temperatures in the Natchitoches area average 60 to 70 degrees during the day, with humidity that drops substantially from the summer's peak. October is, in the traditional practice of the region, the correct month for the year's wood cutting because the combination of warmth and moderate humidity produces faster surface drying than the cold months. Wood cut in October and left in an outdoor pile in reasonable air movement will lose 20 to 30% of its green moisture content in the 6 weeks before the winter rains begin in earnest in December. Theodore cut the wood in the 2nd week of October, and Celine loaded it into the subfloor in the 3rd week, approximately 1 week after cutting. At 1 week from cutting, freshly split cypress and live oak are still losing surface moisture rapidly. The cut faces are dry to the touch, but the inner wood is still releasing moisture through the face. By loading the pieces into the subfloor at this stage, Celine was continuing their drying process in a different environment than the outdoor air, one that was protected from rain entry by the closed south and west faces and ventilated by the open north and east faces on dry days. The subfloor's advantage over continued outdoor drying was that it was consistent. The outdoor pile in November and December was subject to rain events that raised its moisture content back toward greenwood levels each time, while the subfloor maintained the drying gains from the October cutting. The net effect, over the 2 months between October cutting and December use, was that subfloor wood arrived at December fire building at a significantly lower moisture content than outdoor pile wood that had been cut at the same time. She cut the pieces to approximately 16 inches in length, standard Louisiana fireplace length for the common Creole fireplace proportions of the period, and split them to a diameter of 3 to 4 inches on the smaller pieces and 5 to 6 on the larger. Splitting the wood increased the surface area exposed to drying air. A 6-inch diameter unsplit piece had 1/6 the surface area of a 6-inch diameter piece, split into 6 pieces of comparable width. More surface area meant faster moisture loss to the passing air. She had always split wood to fireplace size before storage, as her mother had done before her. But she understood the connection to drying differently after the summer of 1875 than she had before it. The split was not just for fireplace convenience, the split was for moisture removal. The access board on the south face, the board she could remove to reach the wood without going around to the open north face, became a detail that she appreciated more as the winter went on. On the coldest wet mornings in January, retrieving wood from the subfloor through the south access board meant taking 4 steps from the south door of the house to the access board, removing it, reaching in for 6 pieces, replacing the board, and returning inside. Total outdoor exposure, approximately 2 minutes. The alternative, going around the house to the open north face in January rain, would have required a much longer time outdoors and would have brought her into contact with the rain that was blowing from the south, which was also the direction she was walking toward in that scenario. This practical efficiency of the access location, access from the side where you wanted protection from rain, while the open side that let air in was around the corner, was not something she had designed explicitly. She had put the access board on the south face, because the south face was the closed face and the closed face was facing the house's main approach path from the south door. The practical efficiency of the arrangement was a secondary benefit of a location she had chosen for a different reason. She noted this in the spring, told Theodore that the access board being on the south face rather than the north was useful in winter, but she did not present it as a design insight. It was an outcome she appreciated after the fact. The question Jules Metoyer asked in January 1876, how had she come to close the south, specifically was answered by her account of the summer observations, but there was a simpler way to answer it that she did not use because it did not occur to her to offer it. She had closed the south because the rain in Natchitoches Parish came from the south. This is the kind of observation that is obvious once stated, but that requires specific attention to notice. Rain comes from a direction. That direction can be identified. Structures can be built to block that direction while remaining open to other directions. These three statements form the entire conceptual foundation of the system Celine built. They are not complicated statements. They do not require any specialized knowledge to arrive at it. They require attention to the question of where the rain comes from and the willingness to treat that question as an engineering input rather than a background condition. Most people in Nakatosh Parish in 1875 knew that the winter rain came from the south. It was common knowledge the cold fronts came up from the Gulf. The rain came with them. The south wind brought the wet weather. This was the kind of weather knowledge that everyone who had lived in the parish for any length of time possessed without necessarily articulating it. But the next step, treating the direction of the rain as a design input for the subfloor closure, was the step that had not been taken. Because the subfloor had not been conceived as a closable space, Celine took that step because she had been motivated by the winter of 1874 to think about the subfloor as a potential storage space rather than as a fixed architectural feature. And once she was thinking about it as a potential storage space, she was naturally thinking about how to make it function, which required thinking about what would interfere with its function. Wind-driven rain from the south was the most obvious interference. Once the question was being asked, closing the south face was the obvious response. Once the interference had been identified, the system was simple. What had been missing was the specific motivation to think about it, which the winter of 1874 had provided. Once the thinking was done, the boards took 1 day to install and cost 42 cents of lumber from the Nakatosh waterfront merchant. The oak rails were free from the downed timber on the property. The total investment in material and time for a system that eliminated the wetwood problem of Louisiana winters, the problem that everyone in the parish accepted as a fixed condition, was 1 day and 42 cents. The value of that investment, measured in wood not wasted on wet fuel inefficiency over 13 winters before she left the property in 1888, was considerably larger, but she did not calculate it that way. She had a clean fire in December. That was the result she had been working toward. That was enough.